John Cook was born in 1820 and he married Mary Griffin. They were both farming people and they had 7 children, which was a pretty normal number in those days. 4 girls and 3 boys. The boys were Joseph, Walter and Rhodes. Joseph was the eldest, and naturally he got into helping his father immediately. And as far as I know, he remained a farmer all his life. Walter was number 2 in the family, and he realized that Joseph was taking an interest in the farm, so he came away from the farm and went to live with some relatives in Clifton, Bristol. And I think it's pretty certain that one of those relatives or a close friend was a tailor. And Walter probably did an apprenticeship in the tailor's workshop. Once he'd finished his apprenticeship, he set up on his own, and things went quite well. So he invited number 3, Rhodes, to join him in the business in Bristol. And that's where we've got the W&R, Walter and Rhodes. The business prospered, and in the 1880s, they looked for bigger premises. And they found what you've now got on the screen, an enormous building right against the Lower Bristol Road. It was the last building going out of Bath in the direction of Bristol. And behind this building is the River Avon. And it's got a weir, a beautiful weir, outside the back. Notice that the building coming out to the pavement is only a single story, and we will see another slide later on showing what has happened to it. At the back, with the weir, the water of the River Avon was held up by the weir and rushed past the bottom of the building, and there was a big water wheel, a vertical upright water wheel, but not with the water coming in at the top. The paddles of the water wheel extended down into the rushing mill stream, and the water carried the power of the water. And in the days of the carpet factory, which was here before, the power, there you've got it from the back. I don't know exactly where the water wheel, this vertical water wheel, was, but you see you've got the River Avon held up by the weir. You can just on the right-hand side see where the water has fallen down, but the main rush of water was going down below the factory, and that's what supplied the power for the carpet machinery through systems of belts and chains. And Walter and Rhodes decided to buy this property. It was completely empty, of course, at that time. Their biggest customer was a wholesaler called Wilkinson in Birmingham. And with the help of Wilkinson, the two brothers formed a limited company towards the end of the century. Walter was the powerhouse. He controlled the factory, and I think he was pretty hard taskmaster. Rhodes became the salesman, and he went around the country finding customers, and once he'd found a customer, he visited regularly, once in the spring, early spring, and once somewhere around September, October time. So he managed to get substantial orders from men's outfitters, tailors, and enough to keep the factory going. Walter had 3 sons. The first was Kenneth, and he went in for engineering and did his apprenticeship with the Great Western Railway in Swindon. Eventually, he became chief engineer of GWR and designed many engines. The second son, Philip, as far as I can understand it, took off for Canada as soon as he was old enough, and I imagine spent, with his own farm background, spent time farming in Canada. Rhodes had 3 sons. The oldest was my father, Edward. He was 3 years younger than Philip, his cousin. Edward joined W&R Cook when he was about 16 or 17, around 1912. And he was sent off to one of our better customers in Bridgewater called Hooper's, and he was apprenticed there. At that time there was a lot of talk of war, and Edward joined the Territorials. When the First World War started in 1914, both Philip and Edward enlisted. Philip came back from Canada, and he was in what was then called the RFC, the Royal Flying Corps, was the forerunner of the RAF, but I really can't say where he did his service. Edward joined the army and was posted to India, but very soon after he got to India, he was sent back to England for an officer training course, and he was commissioned in the army and spent his time marching up and down Palestine with Allenby's forces. He was a very strong athlete. He had been captain both of cricket and of football in King Edward's School. During the war, thousands of uniforms were needed for men in the trenches. And W&R Cook by then was a strong manufacturer, and they got quite big contracts. This needed more cutters and more machinists. And at one time, the number of employees there's the cutting room. You see all those men wearing their waistcoats and their badge of office, their tape measure around their neck. This, I think, must have been a bespoke section. You see those strange circles. I imagine that that was where the power in the carpet factory days, the power was brought up and turned an axle that was running right down the factory at that time. Rhodes' second son was too young in 1914 to join up, but he joined up, I think, in 1917, and he was trained as a machine gunner. And he, his service took him to the front line, and he was using his machine gun there, and I understand he was a pretty good shot, but a stray shell from the German side landed 3 or 4 feet away from him and his team and killed all the 3 that were in the team. That was in the last fortnight of the Great War. Rhodes' third son was Aubrey, and he was too young for any service in that war. In 1918 to 1925, W&R Cook continued very strong. Let's just look at the front view. And they were a strong enough company to build up. Do you see on the extreme left of the building? That was where there was only 1 floor in the previous slide. Now they've built it up to 3 floors, increasing the amount of space in the workrooms and in the office. Aubrey joined the company, but he realized that too many cooks spoil the broth, and he took himself off to London. Quite a brave move, really. He worked as a cutter for Simpson of Piccadilly for a number of years, and then he moved up the ladder and became manager of the facilities of Simpson in Piccadilly. In 1925, Walter died, leaving a flourishing business in the hands of Rhodes. Rhodes, as I've said before, was a good salesman under Walter, but probably too soft to manage such a big business. Also, Rhodes was very committed to his political career. He served as a councillor for many years. He was a magistrate, and he served a year as mayor of Bath. Talking of the mayor brings me to the thought of the mayor's medalists. Now here is a group of 5 of the people, in this case all women, who had served 50 years in one employment. And every year there was an award ceremony for anyone who had come up to the 50 years during that year. We had more than 12 mayor's medalists, but of course that doesn't compare very favourably with Stothard and Pitts, who had more than 100 mayor's medalists. And I think the whole scheme has fallen by the wayside now, because nobody works for one employer for 50 years nowadays. I should mention the way in which Rhodes did his selling. As I said before, that he went twice a year to his good customers, but it was a rather different world then. He had to pack all his samples, all the new samples, new patterns, into a hamper. And the hamper is a large wicker basket with a top to it. It would be about 3 foot by 5 and 4 foot high. Quite a big item. He planned his trip so that he was going to several businesses in the same direction, take a train, take his hamper, or a porter would take his hamper and put it in the guard's van of the train, and when he got to the town where he had an appointment, he would get out, get a porter, and the porter would put it on his trucks and wheel it down the high street until they found where he was going to show his samples. And he had the task of getting all his samples out of the hamper, showing them to the prospective customer, and then repacking the hamper again. So it was quite a hectic performance. He spent a week away, and each night he would be sleeping in a commercial hotel. But he was good at it. But as I said just now, I don't think he was strong enough to take on the complete factory. In 1926, we come to the general strike. This was an effort by the TUC to get help to improve the conditions for 800,000 coal miners who had been shut out by the owners of the coal mines. I think the owners of the coal mines were intending to reduce the wages, and the miners didn't like that, and they got locked out. And workers in other industries. In total, there was 1.7 million workers on strike. But after a couple of weeks, the TUC realized that they were not making much impact, and they gave up the struggle. But the result of the general strike, especially in areas in South Wales, Somerset, led into a major recession on the next year, 1927. A lot of W&R Cook's customers took delivery of their season's orders and then couldn't pay because there just wasn't money about. There were many bankruptcies. W&R Cook gave a lot of credit to their better customers, but ended up in financial difficulties of their own, and they had to get a heavy overdraft. It took 10 years to get over that recession. The business had just returned to profit at the end of the 1930s when the Second World War broke out. In the Second World War, Philip was 46, but he volunteered for the forces again. The building itself was requisitioned and was used to store RAF spare parts. RAF lorries, which were mostly long, low loaders, brought spare parts which had to be carried off in the building, and similarly other lorries would come and with a requisition for a selection of spare parts. The only spare parts I can remember was as a lad standing on a landing, and wheels destined for Spitfires and Hurricanes were sent down to me on my landing, and I had to catch them as they came down and send them down the next flight. Of course, the wheels for Spitfires and Hurricanes were not big by modern standards. They were very lightweight aircraft. And another thing that we had to store for the RAF were rolls of very heavy gauge chicken wire or netting. And this was used by the RAF to reinforce the runways they were building around the south of the country. We were allowed to run a workshop in about a quarter of the factory, provided the cutters were available to down their shears and to go off at the drop of a hat to load or unload the RAF lorries. As a result of this requisitioning, we lost our storage space. Edward was given a very small petrol ration so he could carry rolls of cloth back and forth as needed by the cutters. One of these premises that my dad rented was a place where now you have Matty's Cafe, just the bottom of Broome Hayes. And another place where he stored rolls of cloth was the basement of the Bloomfield Tennis Club. It was a pretty stressful time for my dad. In addition to running the factory more or less single-handed, he had to negotiate loans from the bank. He had a sizable garden, which he and my mother cultivated and produced vegetables to keep the family going right round the year. I remember we had boxes and boxes of potatoes out of that garden. There was a fair-sized lawn as part of the garden, but of course there was no petrol for running a motor mower. So my parents kept 25 hens and a couple of geese. They could move the geese around the lawn so that the geese were able to eat the grass in different areas, and that produced a Christmas dinner. In addition, Dad was in charge of the Home Guard in Southstoke. So Sunday mornings and Monday evenings, he had to devote to organising exercises for the men in Southstoke and Midford, Coombe Hay, all that area, and they spent a lot of time on Sunday mornings play acting, defending their area from an invasion. Another way in which my father had to do what the government wanted was organising the coupons. Everybody had a certain number of coupons which they could spend on clothing, all textile products. And Dad had to keep control of the coupons. Another thing he had to control was the security of the factory. They didn't want anybody coming into the factory overnight to steal these items for the RAF. And he had to have 2 or 3 men sleeping in the factory every night to make sure the lights weren't showing and to be ready to keep anybody out who wanted to come in. Of course, as you all know, we had a blitz in 1942, and the German bombers were trying to hit the railway going through Bath. they didn't manage to hit the railway, but they came pretty close, and all the windows in the factory were shattered and had to be boarded up. After the war, Philip returned, and Philip and Edward ran the factory. Rhodes died I think it was 1952, about then anyway. But in any case, he hadn't gone out doing any travelling ever since the national strike, ever since 1926, wasn't it? He hadn't done any travelling. And now, after the war, we found that we had lost contact with many of our customers. I arrived on the scene about this time in 1949. No, 1949 I did my military service, 18 months military national service. And then in 1951, my dad tried to interest me in a different career, not in clothing. He showed me, or he arranged a visit to the Swindon engine workshops and showed me round. But the idea of, with no engineering background, the idea of going and doing an apprenticeship in a huge factory of that sort didn't appeal to me. Exactly the same happened with a shipbuilding company in Tyneside. A relative was chief engineer there, and he showed me around that workshop. It was high-powered stuff, but I wasn't really interested in anything of that sort. A friend of the family, Ken Stott, worked in a research horticultural organization somewhere near Yatton, where they researched fruit trees, trying to improve the trees and the best way, finding the best way to prune them and so on. That was more interesting to me, but I didn't follow it up. So rather reluctantly, my father told me to join W&R Cook, which I did in 1951. They sent me to Leeds, because Leeds was the centre of the clothing trade, where I spent 2 years learning about sewing machines, how to use them, designing clothing. Today I'm wearing probably the last jacket that I made from my training period in Leeds. getting a bit tatty now, but I must have made it in 1951 or 1952 in the technical college in Leeds. After 2 years in the technical college, I went and did another year in a factory in Leeds. I spent half of my time in the cutting room, where I got quite hefty corns on my knuckles from using the shears. And the other half I was helping the factory manager. Most of my time was spent with a clipboard and stopwatch, going around the production, taking the times of the girls on the sewing machines and calculating the price that we could put on piecework. That's the word had gone from my head. Piecework. You had to calculate how much the girls earned for doing a particular job. I got reasonably practiced at that. After that experience in Leeds, I went back to W.R. Cook's Bath, and they gave me the job of modernising the coach room. So my experience in Leeds was very valuable for that. And I went round our coach room and trouser room, timing and calculating how to plan the coach room in particular. Here we are, the coach room. You see how close together the machines are. And at that time, the time of the slide, the girls were working all close together, and the girls would collect all the pieces for making one jacket, and they would begin and finish that jacket. There was a great difference between how one girl with experience would do the sewing and another girl who had only just finished her apprenticeship. So it was not easy to control the quality. And I planned to change the method of working so that, for example, three girls would be making the pockets, 2 girls would be sewing up the linings, 1 girl making the sleeves, and 1 girl closing, what we call closing, where you attach the garment itself to its lining. In order to organize that, I needed to arrange bins so that a garment could be thrown into a bin and be easy for the girl who was going to do the closing to pick up the pieces. But in between, you had got to go to hand-working people who would put the two things together with a needle to hold them into place so that the closing could be done by the next person. I had also to arrange steam irons at strategic points so that between one machinist and another there would be a steam iron. The steam came up from the boiler room. The boiler room is that left-hand doorway you can see there on the left. And there were two boilers down there. One was a horizontal boiler, rather like the boiler on a steam engine. That supplied the steam for all the irons and the press room in the factory. The other was only used in the winter. That was an upright boiler and heated up the factory in the winter. Incidentally, the building you're seeing there on the left, certainly in my time, was never used by W&R Cook. A chunk of it was let off to Jeremy Fry, who was just starting up the company Rotork, and his first years he paid a rent and used those buildings on the left-hand side there. You can also see how the weir is tumbling down, coming towards us. When I'd made my plan, I had to get hold of a boiler suit and do some work to put it into action. I helped the engineer, or the engineer helped me, I'm not quite sure which, to reorganize the coach room. The coach room was not on the very top of this building, it was one down. There weren't, in my time, there weren't any floorboards for the windows on the top row. So the coach room got light from the windows on their own floor, and also light coming down from the top row of windows. It was a very, very light room. The big heavy beams were holding the building together, obviously. And it was very handy for me to be able to fix up timbers, 3 inches by 2 inch timbers, from one beam to the next, so that we could run the electricity cables all around the coach room. and provide electricity for the single sewing machine tables that were spread around the room. After 3 years of working on it, we moved the girls to their individual tables, and as a result of that, we were able to control the quality, and the foreman could control the quality, and at the same time increase the production. After I'd done that, I spent some time in the cutting room getting a more stylish cut onto the patterns and cutting out the patterns. It was only after I'd been in W&R Cook for 5 or 6 years that I realized that the sales had decreased, but the production had increased. So that meant that we were selling less than we were producing. And this excess was being sent to our workshop, to our stock rooms around the country. I don't know quite how I've managed it, but I've not said anything about the stock rooms. The stock room, we had quite a number around the country. We had a lot of stock rooms in South Wales, Pontypridd, Bryn Mawr, Swansea, Cardiff, 7 or 8 different stock rooms there, and the tallymen, you may not know that a tallyman is a credit trader, but the tallymen went around on their ponies before the First World War and collected from their customers maybe 50 pence, maybe £1 from each customer, and they kept a ledger controlling the amount of credit that each customer was being granted, and then the tallyman could say, you've got some credit, do you want to buy a garment? And the person concerned, the customer concerned, would say, well, we need a pair of shorts for Jimmy, or we need a new jacket for my husband. It was mostly the housewives who dealt with that. And the tallyman, when he went back the following week, he would take a couple of samples to show the housewife and make a sale. But after the Second World War, the credit traders of that sort were in a decline, so we weren't selling as much from our stock rooms, and Philip and Edward were not controlling the amount we had on the shelves. So our increased production was not reaping any rewards. And we were getting very heavy stocks and having to get loans from the bank, which wasn't making any profit. So I got permission to go round to the stock rooms to reduce the prices, mark the prices down to try to move some of the stock that was on the shelves. Eventually, in 1962, the banks were not willing to increase our overdraft, and we decided to close the factory voluntarily. That is not the same as a bankruptcy. It's a voluntary arrangement. It meant that administrators came in. It was a sad year because they immediately ordered that the factory should be closed down. And there you've got a couple of cuttings from the Chronicle saying that the factory was to close, the one on the right, and the man on the right is a trimmer, and that's what Ron was trained or training to do. The fitter in a cutting room takes the cloth pieces that have been cut out by the cutter, and the fitter has to cut linings that will be the right size to go inside that coat, and put in pieces of cloth to make the pockets and any extras. My dad had a very uncomfortable, sad job. He was employed by the administrators to sell as much stock or sell everything that he could. It was only my dad in the factory with Mr. Hoare to help him. Mr. Hoare was the stock man, and he helped my dad, and eventually they had an auction, and people came, and people who were interested in sewing machines. We had quite a lot of special machines to get the best prices he could. And eventually he managed to sell the building to Bath City Council. And he got 26,000 for the building, which doesn't seem very much by modern standards, a building of that size. As soon as it was sold, or soon after it was sold, the factory was empty, and somebody, I don't think it was ever discovered who, got into the factory from underneath, because there was a little boat harbour, as you might call it, underneath the building, and we feel that people got in through this back door and started a fire in the factory. And you see the article on the left is talking about a blaze in the factory, which took a fair bit of putting out. a lot of the stock in the factory was sold at a reduced price to some of our regular customers. Our Bristol stockroom, Brighton stockroom, Exeter stockroom bought up goods at a cheap price, but no other company was found who was interested in taking the building on. And as I said, it went to the City Council, and the last thing they did in their flood prevention scheme, I think 1966, they pulled down the weir and put a sluice gate in place of the old weir. So that's about the end of what I've got to say, because it's the end of the company.